You're performing beautifully tonight. Sophia Whitmore's champagne glass froze halfway to her lips. The voice behind her was deep, cutting through the elegant chatter of Newport's elite like a blade through silk. She turned slowly, her vintage Chanel dress catching the golden light streaming through Rosecliff Mansion's towering windows. The man facing her was sharply handsome. Dark hair, steel gray eyes, and the kind of jawline that suggested generations of good breeding. But his expression held nothing but cold disdain. I beg your pardon? That touching speech about saving historic buildings. Very passionate. He paused, his gray eyes studying her reaction. Fake. Heat flooded Sophia's cheeks. Around them, Newport's old money elite continued their polite conversations, but she could feel curious glances turning their way. I have no idea what you're talking about, Mr. Ashworth. James Ashworth. His smile was sharp as winter wind. And yes, those Ashworths. Fourth-generation shipping money, if that matters to you. It doesn't. No? Then why did your voice shake when you talked about your family's 4 generations of preservation work? Why did you pause before asking for donations? Why did you look like you might cry when you mentioned financial struggles? Each observation hit like a knife. Sophia felt exposed, like he'd been studying her the whole evening. You seem to have watched my speech very carefully, Mr. Ashworth. I watch everything that wastes my time, and rich girls playing at charity work. His voice got colder. That always wastes my time. Rich girls? Old families pretending they still matter by throwing money at buildings they can't afford to fix. He stepped closer, not friendly, but like a predator. Tell me, Miss Whitmore, how long before you're selling off family jewelry to pay the electric bill? The words hit like slaps. Sophia's careful composure cracked, just for a second. But it was enough. She saw satisfaction flash in his eyes. You don't know anything about my family. I know you're broke and pretending you're not. His smile was cruel. Though you're a good actress, I'll give you that. I'm leaving? Of course you are. Go find some rich idiots who'll actually buy your sob story. Sophia started to walk away, but he wasn't done. You know what's really sad? Historic preservation actually matters. It deserves people who know what they're doing, not desperate amateurs begging for handouts. She turned back, furious. If you care so much, why don't you do something about it instead of just insulting people who are trying? Maybe I will. His smile was like a razor. Though I prefer to invest in people who actually know what they're doing. Sophia walked away feeling like she'd been torn apart by an expert. Behind her, she could feel James Ashworth's cold stare following her across the ballroom. What an absolutely horrible, arrogant bastard, who was probably right about everything. 3 weeks later, Sophia ran into James Ashworth at the hardware store. She was there buying supplies for a volunteer day at one of their preservation sites, the kind of hands-on work that made her feel connected to the buildings she was trying to save. James stood in the paint section, still in expensive casual clothes, talking to the store owner about restoration techniques. When he saw her approaching with her cart full of sandpaper and brushes, his eyebrows went up. Miss Whitmore, actually doing some work yourself today? Mr. Ashworth, slumming it with the regular people? Learning about paint removal from someone who's been doing it for 40 years. You know, actual expertise instead of just writing checks. The dig hit home. Sophia had been thinking the same thing lately, that she managed preservation projects, but rarely got her hands dirty with the actual work. Some of us are too busy running foundations to spend every day playing contractor. Playing? James's voice got sharp. Interesting choice of words. My grandfather always said people who talked about restoration more than they actually did, it usually didn't understand either one very well. Your grandfather sounds like he had opinions about everything. He did. He also said real preservation meant understanding how things were built in the first place, not just hiring people to make them look pretty. And what's your point, Mr. Ashworth? My point is that you can't save something you don't understand. And you can't understand old buildings by reading about them in boardrooms. Are you suggesting I don't understand historic preservation? I'm suggesting there's a difference between managing preservation and actually doing it. Sophia felt her temper rising. And you think buying paint makes you more qualified to discuss historic preservation than someone who's spent her career studying it? I think my family spent 4 generations actually maintaining historic properties. We know what works and what doesn't. Maintaining your own mansion is not the same as preserving buildings for public benefit, isn't it? Because last I checked, the buildings we maintain are still standing. Can you say the same about all your foundation's projects? You arrogant... Right. The word you're looking for is right. James picked up his paint and headed for the checkout. Enjoy your volunteer day, Miss Whitmore. Try not to let your inexperience damage anything irreplaceable. As he walked away, Sophia stood in the paint aisle feeling like he'd just dissected every weakness in her foundation's approach, which made her hate him even more. 2 weeks later, Sophia was walking along the harbor when she spotted the gathering. James Ashworth's yacht dominated the marina like a floating palace, sleek white fiberglass and gleaming chrome, the kind of boat that cost more than most people's houses. Even from a distance, she could hear the laughter and clinking glasses of what was clearly an exclusive party. As she got closer, the scene came into sharp focus. James stood on the deck in perfectly pressed khakis and a navy blazer, a glass of champagne in one hand, surrounded by a flock of beautiful women who hung on his every word. They were the type Sophia recognized from every Newport social event. Blonde, bronzed, and clearly impressed by the combination of his trust fund and his jawline. One redhead in a designer sundress actually giggled as she traced her finger along the yacht's rail. James, this boat is incredible. You must take me sailing sometime. Of course, James replied with that same razor-sharp smile Sophia remembered from the gala. Though I should warn you, real sailing requires getting your hands dirty. More giggles, more adoring looks, more women competing for his attention like he was giving away diamonds. Sophia felt her stomach turn with disgust. Here was old money in all its nauseating glory, a man who'd inherited everything he had, surrounded by women who saw dollar signs instead of character. The whole scene reeked of privilege and entitlement. She tried to walk past without being noticed, but of course, he spotted her. Miss Whitmore. His voice carried across the water with obvious amusement. How lovely to see you. Come to admire the view. The women around him turned to look, their expressions shifting from curiosity to subtle assessment as they sized up potential competition. Sophia stopped walking but didn't move toward the yacht. Just passing through, Mr. Ashworth. Oh, don't be shy. I was just telling my friends about Newport's passionate preservationists. The way he said passionate made it sound like a character flaw. The women laughed appropriately, clearly enjoying the show. I'm sure they're fascinated, Sophia replied coolly. Actually, they are. Aren't you, ladies? A chorus of agreement, though Sophia noticed their smiles were more predatory than friendly. Tell me, James continued, stepping closer to the yacht's rail. How is that little community service project of yours? Still teaching underprivileged children to... What was it? Appreciate historic buildings? Still trying to give kids opportunities that weren't handed to them at birth. The barb hit its mark. She saw something flicker across his face before the smooth mask slid back into place. How noble. Though I have to ask, when was the last time you actually worked on a building restoration yourself, Miss Whitmore? You seem to spend so much time talking about historic preservation. I wondered if you'd ever gotten your hands dirty with the actual work. It was a direct challenge, delivered with just enough smugness to make her blood boil. The women around him were practically purring with second-hand superiority. I don't need a floating status symbol to connect with the ocean, Mr. Ashworth. Status symbol? He laughed, but there was something forced about it. This is a working vessel, built for performance, not show. Really? And what exactly does it perform, besides impressing women who are easily impressed? The words came out sharper than she'd intended, cutting through the cocktail party atmosphere like a blade. The women's laughter died abruptly. But instead of getting angry, James just stared at her. For a moment, his carefully constructed arrogance slipped, revealing something that looked almost like confusion. He was used to women being dazzled by the yacht, by the champagne, by the effortless display of wealth. Used to being the most desirable man at any gathering. But Sophia Whitmore was looking at him like he was something unpleasant she'd found on her shoe, and for just a split second, she saw him blink, a tiny crack in his confidence that suggested he didn't quite know what to do with someone who wasn't impressed. "Well," he said finally, his voice a little less smooth than before, "I suppose not everyone appreciates quality craftsmanship." "You're right," Sophia replied. "Some of us can tell the difference between craftsmanship and showing off." She turned to leave, but his voice stopped her. "Miss Whitmore?" "Yes." "Enjoy your walk. Try not to let the sight of people actually enjoying their success ruin your evening." It was meant to be a dismissive final word, but Sophia caught something in his tone, a note of uncertainty that hadn't been there before, like a man who just discovered that his usual weapons weren't working. As she walked away, she could hear the women immediately clustering around him, their voices bright with reassurance and renewed attention. But she'd seen that moment of confusion, that flicker of something that might have been vulnerability. James Ashworth wasn't used to being dismissed, and he clearly didn't know what to make of someone who couldn't be bought, impressed, or charmed by everything that had always worked before, which, she had to admit, was almost satisfying enough to make up for having to witness his nauseating display of privilege. The crisis came 6 weeks later, during what should have been a simple volunteer project. Sophia was at the Cranston House, a 1740s colonial they were restoring as a community center, when everything went wrong. A group of local teenagers was helping strip paint from the original woodwork, learning traditional restoration techniques as part of their community service. Then 17-year-old Marcus, working on a window frame, discovered something that made him call her over urgently. "Miss Whitmore, this wood is rotting from the inside. The whole frame is going to collapse." Sophia looked at the window Marcus had been working on. What had appeared to be solid wood was actually a shell over completely rotted timber. If the window frame failed, it could take part of the wall with it. "Everyone stop working," she called out. "We need to evacuate this room." But as the teenagers were gathering their tools, she heard a cracking sound. The window frame was starting to give way, and 15-year-old Aaliyah was directly underneath it. Sophia sprang forward, shoving the girl out of harm's way just as a mass of rotting wood and plaster, nearly 200 pounds, collapsed behind them. It was the most talked-about disaster of the Newport summer, splashed across every local news outlet. When James saw the footage, Sophia shielding the girl with her body, the building folding in on itself like a house of cards, something inside him cracked wide open. A week later, the sterile hum of fluorescent lights replaced the echo of collapsing beams. In a quiet wing of Newport General Hospital, the world was reduced to heart monitors and the faint scent of antiseptic. Sophia drifted back to consciousness like surfacing from deep water. Everything hurt. Her head felt like it had been split open, her ribs screamed with every breath, and there was a strange taste of dust and blood in her mouth. The beeping of machines came in and out of focus, along with the antiseptic smell of hospital rooms. She tried to remember what had happened. The Cranston house. Marcus calling out about rotting wood. Aaliyah standing under the window frame as it started to collapse. Aaliyah. Sophia forced her eyes open, blinking against harsh fluorescent lights, white ceiling tiles, bland hospital walls, the steady rhythm of a heart monitor, and a figure by the door. Tall, dark-haired, standing perfectly still with his hands in his pockets. Watching her with an expression she couldn't read through the haze of painkillers and concussion. James Ashworth? That couldn't be right. Why would he be here? She blinked again, trying to clear her vision. Maybe she was hallucinating. Maybe the head injury was worse than she thought. But when she looked again, he was still there, just standing by the doorway like he belonged there, like he had every right to be watching her sleep. "Is that—" she started to say, but her voice came out as barely a whisper. He didn't move, didn't come closer, just stood there studying her like she was a puzzle he couldn't solve. Sophia tried to lift her head, tried to focus enough to ask what he was doing there, but the effort sent waves of dizziness washing over her. She closed her eyes, fighting nausea. When she opened them again, he was gone. A nurse bustled in, checking monitors and adjusting something in her IV. "How are we feeling, honey? Was there—" Sophia's voice was hoarse, barely working. "Was someone here?" "Your father was here earlier, went to get coffee, should be back soon." "No, someone else. A man. Dark hair, The nurse frowned, checking her chart. I didn't see anyone else, but you've had a pretty serious concussion. Sometimes people see things that aren't quite right when they're coming out of anesthesia. 3 weeks later, Sophia stood at the podium of the historic Newport Society, her ribs still tender but her voice strong. The room was packed. Word had spread quickly about the accident at the Cranston house, about the teenage volunteer who'd spotted dangerous structural problems that certified inspectors had missed, about the foundation director who'd nearly died protecting a kid. I want to talk about failure, Sophia began, her hands steady on the podium despite her nerves. About what happens when you think you know what you're doing, but you don't. Murmurs rippled through the audience. This wasn't the usual fundraising speech they expected. 3 weeks ago, I almost got a 15-year-old girl killed because I trusted paperwork more than I trusted the building itself, because I relied on inspections and certifications instead of actually understanding what I was trying to preserve. She could see people shifting in their seats, surprised by her honesty. Marcus, 17 years old, never owned a power tool in his life, spotted structural damage that 3 professional inspectors missed. Aaliyah learned more about historic woodworking in 6 months than I learned in 6 years of running a preservation foundation. Her voice caught slightly, and she paused to collect herself. These kids didn't join our program because they cared about old buildings. They joined because a judge told them they had to do community service, but somewhere along the way something happened. They started to care. Not because I taught them to care, but because the buildings themselves taught them. From the back of the room, she spotted a familiar figure leaning against the wall. James Ashworth, arms crossed, watching her with an intensity that made her momentarily lose her train of thought. Why was he here? She forced herself to focus on her speech. When that window frame collapsed, my first thought wasn't about insurance or liability or foundation protocols. It was about getting Aaliyah to safety. Because in that moment, I realized that she mattered more than any building we could ever restore. The room was completely quiet now. Sophia's eyes found James again. He hadn't moved, but something in his expression had changed. The cold assessment was gone, replaced by something she couldn't quite read. Her voice grew stronger, more certain. Marcus saved my life that day, not just by pulling me out of the debris, but by showing me what our work actually means. These kids don't see old buildings as monuments to the past. They see them as possibilities for the future. The applause started slowly, then built until the entire room was on its feet. But Sophia barely heard it. She was watching James, who had straightened up from the wall and was staring at her with an expression that looked almost like recognition, not the arrogant dismissal she'd grown used to. As the applause died down and people began moving toward the reception, James remained where he was, just watching, just thinking. That night, James sat in his study with a glass of whiskey he wasn't drinking, staring out at the harbor lights and thinking about Sophia's speech. He'd spent months telling her she was incompetent, that her work was amateur theater. But watching her today, seeing her admit her failures with such devastating honesty, seeing 17 teenagers look at her like she'd given them something precious, he realized he'd been catastrophically wrong. Not just about her methods, about her heart. The woman he'd dismissed as a desperate socialite had built something that transformed lives. The foundation he'd called a joke was teaching kids like Marcus that they belonged in places they'd never thought they could access, and he'd almost destroyed it all with his arrogance. James picked up his phone and dialed his lawyer. "Richard Pemberton," he said when the call connected. "I want to know everything about his business dealings, especially anything involving historic preservation organizations." The evening sun was painting Newport Harbor in shades of gold and rose when James spotted her. Sophia sat alone at the end of the pier, her legs dangling over the water, silhouetted against the dying light. She wore a simple white linen dress that caught the breeze, her dark hair loose around her shoulders instead of pulled back in its usual severe style. Even from a distance, he could see the tension in her posture, the way she held herself like someone carrying an impossible weight. James had come to the harbor to think about her speech 3 days ago, about everything he'd assumed and everything he'd gotten wrong. He'd learned about her mother's death from someone at the society, cancer. 18 months of watching someone you love fade away. No wonder she'd looked ready to break that first night at the gala. He approached slowly, his footsteps quiet on the weathered planks. As he got closer, he could see that her cheeks were flushed, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "Sophia?" She turned at the sound of his voice, immediately straightening, her defenses snapping into place like armor. But when she saw his expression, gentler than she'd ever seen it, something in her posture softened. "James." Her voice was wary but not hostile. "What are you doing here?" "Saw you from the harbor road. You looked—" He paused, studying her face in the golden light. Troubled. Instead of his usual arrogant confidence, there was something almost hesitant in his manner, like he was approaching a wounded animal he didn't want to startle. "May I?" He gestured to the dock beside her. She nodded, and he settled next to her, close enough that their knees touched. The contact sent a small shock through both of them, unexpected, electric. "What's wrong?" His voice was quiet, genuinely concerned. Sophia was quiet for a moment, staring out at the water. "Just thinking about my mother. She used to love watching the sunset from this spot." "Your mother," he said softly. "I heard. I'm sorry." She glanced at him, surprised. "How did you—" "People talk. Especially about families like yours." He paused. 18 months. That's a long time to watch someone suffer. Sophia felt tears threatening again. She loved this harbor. Used to say the water reminded her that some things were permanent, even when everything else felt temporary. James watched her profile as she spoke, noticing how the evening light caught the curve of her cheek, the way her white dress made her skin look luminous. When had she stopped being the brittle socialite he'd dismissed and become this, someone achingly real and beautiful in her vulnerability? "She would have been proud of your speech the other day," he said. "Would she?" Sophia's laugh was shaky. "I basically admitted I've been incompetent at the one thing our family cares about most." "You admitted you were learning. That takes more courage than pretending you know everything." She turned to look at him fully, and he felt something shift in his chest at the sight of her. Eyes bright with tears, cheeks flushed from crying, utterly without pretense. "Are you feeling all right? You're being unusually kind to me." "Maybe I'm learning too." Their eyes held for a moment, and Sophia felt her breath catch. There was something different in the way he was looking at her. Not the cold assessment she was used to, but something warmer. Something that made her skin tingle where their knees touched. "Learning what?" "That I might have been wrong about a few things." His voice was rough, almost reluctant. "About you. About what you're trying to accomplish." "Everything's so complicated right now," she whispered. "The foundation's struggling. My father's been distant since Mom died. I feel like I'm failing at everything that mattered to her." The sun was almost gone now, leaving them in the soft twilight that made everything feel more intimate, more possible. The phone call came 3 weeks later at 6 a.m. on a Tuesday. "Miss Whitmore? This is Agent Patricia Morrison, FBI Financial Crimes Division. We need to discuss irregularities in your foundation's accounting practices." Sophia's blood went cold. "What kind of irregularities?" "The kind that suggest systematic embezzlement of federally funded charitable assets. We'll need to review all financial records, grant documentation, and communications with major donors." "I don't understand." "Miss Whitmore? Someone has been stealing from your foundation. We have bank records, transfer documents, and testimony from someone who contacted our office." "Who contacted your office?" "I can't say, but I can tell you that this investigation will result in federal charges unless we can prove the money was reported missing and paid back through proper channels." After Agent Morrison hung up, Sophia sat in her kitchen, staring at her coffee and trying to process what she'd just learned. Someone had been stealing from the foundation, someone who had access to her father's office. She found Thomas Whitmore in his study, surrounded by scattered papers and looking every one of his 73 years. "Dad, we need to talk." "About the FBI investigation?" Sophia's heart sank. "You know about it?" "I've been expecting it for months." He looked up from the financial documents spread across his desk. "Sophia, I need to tell you something about your mother's medical bills. Her father had been systematically stealing foundation money to pay for her mother's cancer treatment. Experimental therapies insurance wouldn't cover, clinical trials that offered hope when traditional medicine had none left to give. $200,000 over 18 months. The Patterson development deal, he explained, his voice breaking. I thought it would come through in time. They offered 4 times what the estate is worth, enough to pay everything back. But the deal fell through. Environmental problems. The developers couldn't get permits. So you kept taking from foundation accounts. I kept trying to save your mother's life. Sophia stared at the man who'd been her hero. The foundation board trusted him completely. Federal agencies considered him beyond reproach, and he'd been stealing to pay for cancer treatments that couldn't save his wife anyway. Dad, this destroys everything. The foundation, our reputation, our family's legacy. I know. Federal charges, prison time, complete shutdown of every program we've built. Those kids, Marcus, Aaliyah, all the teenagers who depend on our programs, they lose everything because you couldn't accept that Mom was dying. Thomas Whitmore looked at his daughter with the expression of a man who'd made impossible choices and was finally facing their consequences. I'm sorry. How much time do we have? Before the federal investigation finishes? 6 weeks, maybe 8 if we're lucky. And if we can't fix this? Then I go to prison, the foundation is shut down, and you spend the next decade explaining how your family became famous for stealing from charity. That afternoon, Sophia found herself standing in the grand ballroom of the Vanderbilt mansion, afternoon sunlight streaming through tall windows and casting golden patterns across the polished wooden floor. This had been her mother's favorite building in all of Newport. When Sophia was 7, 8, 9 years old, her mother would bring her here during restoration committee meetings. While the adults discussed budgets and timelines, Elizabeth Whitmore would take her daughter's small hand and waltz around the empty ballroom, humming old songs and teaching her the steps her own grandmother had taught her. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. Feel the music in your feet, Sophia. The building remembers every dance it's ever held. Now the ballroom stood empty again. But Sophia could still hear the echo of her mother's voice, still feel the ghost of those childhood afternoons when the world felt safe and beautiful and permanent. She closed her eyes and tried to imagine her mother here, young and laughing, spinning around this same floor in the evening gown she'd worn to her debut. But all she could picture was the hospital room, the machines, the way her mother's hand had felt so fragile in those final weeks. The sound of footsteps in the hallway made her turn. James Ashworth appeared in the doorway, his expression gentle, careful. I'm sorry, he said quietly. I didn't mean to intrude. I saw your car outside. It's fine. Sophia wiped her eyes quickly. Just remembering. Your mother loved this place. She did. We used to dance here when I was little. She'd sneak me in during foundation meetings and teach me to waltz. Her voice broke slightly. She said every historic building held the memory of all the joy that had happened inside it. James stepped into the ballroom, his footsteps soft on the ancient floors. She was right. Was she? Because all I can think about now is that we're going to lose it. My father is facing prison time. The foundation is being shut down. All these buildings my mother loved will probably be sold to developers who'll turn them into hotels or condos. Sophia's voice was getting stronger now, anger mixing with grief. This ballroom, the library where she read to me, the music room where she taught me piano, it'll all be gone. Everything she worked to preserve, everything she believed in, destroyed because my father couldn't accept that cancer was going to win. She turned away from James, looking out the tall windows at the manicured gardens beyond. The tears came harder now, months of grief and fear and impossible pressure finally breaking through her careful composure. I used to think I understood what loss meant when she died, but losing her and then losing everything she cared about, it feels like losing her twice. James was very quiet for a moment. When he spoke, his voice was gentle but certain. Sophia, you don't have to cry about the buildings. Something in his tone made her turn around. The investigation, the foundation, your father. It's all going to be fine. She stared at him, seeing something in his expression that she couldn't quite read. As the afternoon light dimmed around them, Sophia caught a change in his gaze, a quiet tenderness and unspoken softness, as he stood there, no longer guarded, simply watching her. The next morning, Sophia found her father in his study, but instead of the defeated man she'd left there the night before, Thomas Whitmore was sitting up straight, a stack of legal documents spread across his desk, and something that looked almost like hope in his eyes. "Dad? What's happening?" "Sit down, sweetheart. We need to talk." "If this is about turning ourselves into the FBI investigation is over." Sophia stared at him. "What do you mean, over?" "Closed, no charges, full restitution documented. The foundation is cleared of all wrongdoing." "That's impossible. How could they?" "Because someone paid back every penny. $237,000 transferred to the foundation's accounts with full documentation showing the money was returned before any federal inquiry began." Sophia sank into the chair across from his desk. "Who would do that?" "The same person who hired the law firm that's been handling our case. The same person who funded a private investigation that uncovered Richard Pemberton's insurance fraud scheme. The same person who's been anonymously funding restoration projects all over Newport for the past 6 weeks." "Dad, you're not making sense." Thomas leaned forward, his voice gentle. "James Ashworth, Sophia. James Ashworth saved us." "That's impossible. James barely tolerates me. He's spent months telling me I'm incompetent. He's been protecting our family's legacy long before you even knew it needed protection." Sophia felt the room spinning. "How do you know this?" "Because Margaret Chen called me this morning. Mrs. Chen's daughter works for the Ashworth Trust. She told her mother, who told me, that James has been funding historic preservation projects under anonymous grants since the day after your accident at the Cranston house." "Which projects?" "The Vanderbilt Mansion Ballroom, the music room at Rosecliff, the library at the Preservation Society. Every building your mother loved, every place where you have memories together. He's been ensuring their restoration and maintenance for the next 50 years. Sophia's breath caught. "The ballroom where Mom and I used to dance?" "Fully restored and endowed. He even hired craftsmen to repair the original chandeliers using 19th century techniques." "But why would he do all that without telling me?" "Because he didn't want you to feel obligated to him. Because he wanted to preserve what mattered to you whether or not you ever found out he was responsible." Thomas reached across the desk and took his daughter's hand. "Sophia, that young man has spent more money protecting our family's legacy than we've ever had in our foundation's budget. And he did it all while letting you believe he thought your work was worthless." Sophia felt tears burning her eyes. James Ashworth had been quietly saving every single thing that mattered to her. And he'd done it all while pretending he barely cared whether she lived or died. "Where is he now?" she asked quietly. "Probably at the harbor. But Sophia, there's something else. The community meeting about the investigation is this afternoon. The press will be there, along with all the families whose kids are in our programs. They need to hear that the foundation is safe." 3 hours later, Sophia stood in front of the packed community center, looking out at faces she'd known for years, parents, volunteers, board members, and in the front row, 17 teenagers who'd become the heart of everything she'd tried to build. "6 months ago, I thought I understood what historic preservation meant," she began. "I thought it was about saving old buildings and teaching traditional skills. I thought it was about protecting the past." Marcus raised his hand. "What do you think it means now?" "Now I think it's about creating connections. Between people and places, between generations, between what we've inherited and what we're going to leave behind." She looked around the room, seeing the faces of people who'd trusted her with something precious. Their children's futures, their community's heritage, their faith that some things were worth preserving. "Who saved us?" called out Aliyah from the front row. "Someone who loves this community enough to protect it." Before she could say anything else, Marcus stood up and started walking toward her. Then, Aliyah. Then, all 17 teenagers were moving forward, wrapping her in a group hug that left her laughing and crying at the same time. "Thank you," Marcus whispered, "for not giving up on us. Thank you for not giving up on this place." she whispered back. As the teenagers stepped back, Sophia looked up and saw James standing by the door, watching with an expression that took her breath away. She walked toward him, and he straightened, his professional mask sliding back into place. "Congratulations," he said quietly. "I heard the investigation was resolved." "It was, thanks to someone's incredible generosity." "Well, I'm sure whoever helped knows that the Foundation's work is worth supporting." Sophia stepped closer, close enough to see the uncertainty in his gray eyes, the way he was trying so hard to maintain distance when all she wanted was to close the space between them. "James, I know it was you." His careful composure cracked completely. "Sophia, I know about the money you transferred, about the legal fees, the investigation into Pemberton, the anonymous grants for the historic buildings. I know about the ballroom where my mother and I used to dance." She watched him struggle for words, watched the man who was never at a loss for cutting remarks rendered speechless by being caught in an act of extraordinary love. "I know you saved my father from prison and my foundation from destruction. I know you preserved every building my mother ever cared about. I know you did it all while letting me believe you thought I was incompetent. Sophia, I can explain." For a moment, they just stood there in the doorway, the space between them electric with months of unspoken tension. James took a half step toward her, his hand starting to rise toward her face, and Sophia felt her breath catch. But then someone called her name from inside the community center, breaking the spell. They both stepped back, the almost moment dissolving into careful distance. "We should..." James gestured toward the celebration. "Yes, we should." But neither of them moved, caught in the pull of something that felt too big and too important to interrupt with words. Finally, James cleared his throat. "Sophia, there's so much I need to tell you." "I know." And then, without another word, she stepped forward and wrapped her arms around him. The hug started as gratitude, but the moment her body pressed against his, everything changed. James went perfectly still for a heartbeat, then his arms came around her with desperate intensity, pulling her closer like he was afraid she might disappear. Time seemed to stop. The sounds of the community center faded into background noise as they held each other in the doorway, neither willing to be the first to let go. Sophia could feel his heart pounding against her chest, could smell the familiar scent of his cologne mixed with something uniquely him. His hands spread across her back, one tangling in her hair, the other pressed against her spine like he was memorizing the feel of her. The electricity between them was undeniable, months of tension and conflict and unspoken attraction crackling in the space between their bodies. Every breath they shared seemed charged, every point of contact sending heat racing through her veins. She'd never felt anything like this overwhelming sense of rightness, of coming home to a place she didn't know she'd been searching for. James buried his face in her hair, and she felt him tremble slightly, like holding her was both the thing he'd wanted most, and the thing that terrified him beyond measure. They might have stayed that way forever, locked in an embrace that said everything words couldn't express. But eventually, Sophia began to pull back, ready to look into his eyes and finally speak the truth that had been building between them for months. But as she started to step away, James's hand caught the back of her head, his fingers threading through her hair with gentle but firm pressure. Their eyes met for one electric moment, his gray gaze dark with longing, hers wide with surprise and anticipation. Then he pulled her back to him and kissed her. It wasn't gentle or tentative. It was the kiss of a man who'd been holding back for months, who'd been dying to touch her, to taste her, to pour all his hidden feelings into this one perfect moment. His lips moved against hers with desperate hunger, and she melted into him completely, her hands fisting in his shirt as she kissed him back with equal intensity. The world around them, the community center, the celebrating families, the entire town of Newport, simply ceased to exist. There was only this, his mouth on hers, his hands in her hair, the overwhelming sensation of finally being exactly where she belonged. When they broke apart, both breathing hard, he rested his forehead against hers. "I've been in love with you since the night you threw yourself in front of falling debris to save a kid you barely knew."